Cinema and media are more than just storytelling tools. They are powerful reflections of our society, shaping perspectives, influencing ideologies, and redefining identities. The way history is portrayed on screen, particularly through the female gaze, challenges traditional perspectives and profoundly impacts how audiences see themselves and the world. As we dissect the nuances of representation, power dynamics, and evolving narratives that unfold within the cinematic space, which both reflects and shapes our understanding of them.
Today, the title itself is, I think, very prevalent enough and something that does not need any further introduction, that when we talk about gaze, when we talk about cinema, gender is a question that we constantly ask about, because we are no longer just consuming the media as it is. We are questioning everything. So with that being in mind, we have three very distinguished speakers from their field, which are very recognized, and at the same time, they have an intersection of that in cinema. So with that, I just want to kind of take this moment to, I'll talk a little bit about cinema as well, because it has also been my love as well. Recently discovered love, but yes, a very deep love. That when we talk about cinema, it's more than just entertainment. It's a mirror, it's a battleground, it's a canvas where identities are shaped and constructed and contested at the same time. So when we talk about gender and gaze, what we are really asking is that whose desire are we watching? When we talk about, okay, someone is being desirable, whose desire are being represented on the screen? And these are the questions that we want to delve in today's conversation. And by the end of our discussion, we'll open the platform to all of you as an audience, and you can ask the question to our distinguished guests accordingly. So on that note, let's just begin this session. Maybe we can start with Julia, you, and when we talk about, the journey that we have seen in cinema and entertainment industry, we see there has been a lot of change, there have been a lot of evolution, there has been a lot of contestation as well. How do you see these evolution happening in cinema? Because you had a profound history and you have worked very closely with some of the directors. Some of the directors are also your friends. So in that note, so her husband has been the director as well. So when you see all of these things happening, how do you see the evolution in cinema, not just in India, but in worldwide, how it has reshaped? If you could just start with...
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this event. India is my birthplace. I was born in New Delhi. Yes, it's a little bit far from Bangalore, and I've never been to Bangalore, so I'm very happy to be here. So it's a homecoming, sort of. Yeah. Your question, it's a... how many hours do you have? Could write a book about that.
Only 50 minutes, but...
Yeah, no, I'm just... 15 minutes, that's already a lot more than I expected. Anyway, I have... in one of my columns I wrote that I have been associated with two Fs, feminism and films, because I believe that films are, because of their mass nature, it's a very good way to, effective way of spreading ideas and including about gender norms and stereotypes. Obviously, there has been a change. I am familiar with films from various countries, but later on I will focus on some Indonesian films. But before I go into that, I'm not really a film person like my two colleagues here on the left. So I'm not being defensive or anything, but I'd like to explain what my foray into the world of films. And in 1996, I organized this film festival. It's called the Jakarta International Women's Film Week, which I thought up of, I had organized a discussion the previous year with some women diplomats, and I thought, okay, in 1995, and thought, what will we do next? So I thought a film festival would be great. So and then somebody suggested, it was previously the British Council that had supported me, and the British Council director said, why don't you ask UNESCO to support you? So I did, I approached them, and to make a very long story short, festival on my own. So as you can see here, it's on the back, it says it's organized by Julia Sirakusuma and supported by UNESCO. So it was, I worked together with embassies so I didn't actually curate the films, but I gave them terms of reference, and they provided films which was suited to the framework of the festival. It was held mainly at the Erasmushuis, which is the Dutch Cultural Center, so we had diplomatic immunity, which meant that the films were not censored. Now, we're talking about 1996. This is the height of the New Order, which I don't know if you know about the New Order. It's the regime, a military-dominated regime, from 1966 to 1998. And at the time, it was censorship was very much a part of the state control over society and media, films, and everything. So that was really quite a revolutionary thing, this film festival, because it was not censored. And my husband, who was a film director, was actually quite jealous of me. And he said, you're entering my kingdom. Oh, I didn't know it was your kingdom. But anyway, it was very successful. It ran for 4 days. And then I had to, the next month I had to go to Japan to be a visiting research scholar at Kyoto University. And the following year, UNESCO stole the idea from me. I mean, they didn't pay me, they didn't recognize me or anything like that. So I feel it's important to tell this story because films exist in a context, not just at the time. Of course, I'm talking about the Indonesian context at the time, but we're talking about UNESCO. You know, UNESCO stealing the film festival created by an Indonesian woman. You know, I actually went to the successor of this director at the time, and he acknowledged that they had made a criminal act. So, but I didn't. But then I got cancer, and then so I couldn't continue. I didn't take them to court. So I think rather than answering your questions in a detailed way, I would like to talk about two films, Indonesian films, which really struck my attention lately. And one of them is called Marlina. It's a murder in 4 acts. And it's a film it's set in Sumba. Sumba Island is east of Bali. And it's one of the things it's known for is bride kidnapping. So, which is really interesting, but it was not featured in the film at all. So the film is about this woman, Marlina, who was attacked by a bunch of thieves and well, she ended up being a rapist who just came. There were 7 of them, and her husband was there, but he was in the form of a mummy sitting in the corner of a room, so he couldn't exactly protect her. So anyway, these thugs, they took all of the stuff and the cattle and chicken and goats and all that, and then they ordered her to make dinner, to cook for them. And so, being a woman, and women can be sneaky, which is very good. And she made some chicken soup, and put some poisoned it. So the ones who had the soup were died. Okay, and then one of them raped her, and while she was being raped, she took a a machete and chop the man's head off. Okay, so the film is called satay Western. You know what satay is? Satay is barbecued meat. Barbecued, it can be chicken, it can be meat. It's Indonesian. It's an Indonesian name. It's an Indonesian dish, and it's called satay Western, which is inspired by the spaghetti Western. Are you familiar with spaghetti Westerns? They tend to be more violent than American Westerns, and low budget. So I think it's a little bit offensive to call Marlena I don't know if it's low budget or not, but in any case, the film is a combination of a satay Western. It's also a road movie. It's a revenge movie. So anyway, she carries this man's head in a sling, in a cloth sling, and she goes on a horse, which is probably why it's called a satay Western. And she's intending to go to the police station. So that's the road movie part of the film. And then she gets to the police station, and they go into all this bureaucracy about, well, we don't have all the things to examine, and I mean, she's raping. She is reporting that she was raped and she murdered her rapist. And here's the head of my rapist. And the police are kind of busy with the bureaucracy and, well, this, that, and the other. So, and then she makes friends with this other woman who is pregnant, and she's. The pregnant woman is having difficulty going to labor, and the husband says that, oh, maybe it's because you were fooling around with another guy. It's not really my child.
Sorry to cut you here, but we have recently, not just this month, but I think early this January, we have screened Marlene the Murder of the
So you're familiar with that film?
Yes, and all of our students have been
you've
sent
seen
details.
it. You've seen it.
Half of them, I could vouch for them, but others got the description.
Well, that's great. I mean, I chose that film not because I knew, because of that reason, because I just thought it was a great movie.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's one. So this is a woman who's been raped, and it's about how men feel entitled to just take anything they want. They take the wealth of this woman and they rape her. They ask her to cook and all that. But she has her smarts, and so she takes revenge. But she's also, she knows she's committed a crime. She goes to the police, and then the police say, well, it's really weird. So anyway, that's basically, we could go into a much deeper discussion about that.
Definitely, I think all our speakers, audience would be learning to know more about this film, and I would suggest everyone to please do watch it if you have not. It's an Indonesian film called Marlena, Murder in the Fourth Act.
It's on Netflix.
It's also on Netflix. It's just 1.5 hour film. So with that, I would like to kind of switch to other speakers.
Okay, I'll talk about the other film later.
Yes, I'll come with that question later.
Okay.
So maybe Mayank, you could take, and you can tell us about the journey that you have seen and the way you have seen the transformation of cinema, and what is your commentary, if I would say, if you would go back to the time when you started, film critiquing, and in the contribution that you made in the book called Rendezvous with Hindi Cinema, you have mentioned the first film that you have reviewed and under what circumstances. So maybe you can just highlight, the same to us, audience, and how do you see the transformation being taken place in Bollywood as such?
Yeah, well, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for what a fascinating conversation we're likely to have on cinema and gender. Julie said we're two film people. I used to be a film critic. Now everyone here in this room is a film critic. And that's really where we are. And since the question is whose gaze is it, genuinely the gaze is, and as it were with cinema, the lens and also the mirror, right? So the gaze is as much the person who's showing you what they're showing you as the audience that's receiving it. And it's not a one-way exercise. And now even film reviewing is no more a one-way exercise. All of you have your voice and you express it. I think that was not so much the case, say, but in the 1990s onwards, if you look at mainstream Hindi films, and if you look at the gaze that it projected, the gaze that it represented, where we've come a huge and a long way since when it comes to representation of women per se, from back in the 70s to when rape as a trope was used in a very coy expression of carnal desire, and of course there would be that scene where the villain, and of course it's a villain, all right, where the villain is literally laughing and disrobing her, and that moment is seen as a moment of titillation by an audience. There was primarily a male audience watching cinemas in theaters, of course, and at that very moment you will have the hero drop in with his bike, cutting through the glass and saving that girl from this particular incident that she's right in the middle of. But I mean, if you also look at the gaze of the projected gaze of the hero is usually the stalker, and he's always known persistence as the commonest route to love. There's the same guy, you can name them, an Akshay Kumar or Anil Kapoor or even Aamir Khan. They would be standing outside someone's apartment, and and if she said no, she's just being tiki, right? And she's being spicy, and that no is just a no for now. It can become a yes depending on how long the hero stays put in that persistence to get the girl he wants, and eventually he gets that girl. Now from there to where we are now is a massive, massive change. And if there is anything positive that I've seen as a film reviewer, as a film critic, I mean, again, as I said, all of your film critics, I only get paid for it. If there is any change that I've seen, is actually in feminism, is actually in gender. I don't see that much change in politics. I think we've regressed. There isn't much we can talk about, especially with partisan politics. You just cannot mention anything anymore. I think we've regressed far more when it comes to religion. For instance, it's just off the table. You just cannot talk religion in our popular culture anymore. But I think if you see the representation of women from the 70s, especially the 80s, as much the 90s to where we are in 2025, oh my God, yes. There's been a huge leap. And of course, these things are obviously always relative, always subjective. There's huge scope for far more ahead, but it's never been better, honestly speaking.
Thank you so much. So I'll take the next question to Sonali, for you to introduce, because your work literally intersect between gender and literature at the same time, and you have also been very upfront and critical about the perspective and about both empowering part of critical lens of as a feminism, as well as how it has been appropriated in a certain manner. So maybe if you could just give us idea, because when we talk about women's role, which has been evolved in Bollywood and in other Indian cinema, we see that there is always a representation of strong Indian female character. But how do you see and where do you see the genuinity, or where do you see the tokenism that has been taken in feminism? So if you could just take
Yeah, lovely question and a lovely discussion, really. I think there's so much here that I want to respond to in what already Julia and Mayank have said and what you have said. But to first come to what you're saying, very important. How do we discern where there is empowerment or where there is, let's say, I would not want to use the word genuine entirely, because genuine to whom? And whose feminism in that sense, because there's multiple kinds of feminisms out there, right? But yes, if we want to look at the idea of whether women's agency is truly being reflected on screen, I think that's where I would say, feminist or not, real change comes in, right? And when I say screen, I also think we need to look at what's happening behind the screen. So it's very possible that's why individual empowerment can only go so far. So it's very possible that you have actresses, for instance, who are taking, as Mayank said, large strides in Bollywood cinema, very exciting films are being made and so on. They're fetching, income at par with, let's say, male actors and so on. However, I wonder how much say do they have in terms of on-screen objectification or commodification, right? So it's never a linear or simple question. It's always a complex question. Rahi baat like empowerment, right? How does cinema empower and so on? My work actually doesn't look at cinema in terms of a service to society, so much as what are the politics of this film and what does it tell us about the society that we are in today, right? So when we are looking at also change, yes, there has been so much change, and that's really a good thing. So many women behind the camera. Right? I can think of a film like Alankrita Srivastava's, I don't know how many of you have seen it, Lipstick, right? Lipstick Under My Burqa. Or if you've seen the Netflix series Bombay Begum. Yeah. I loved it. but again, right, yes. But so much more to ask for, because Julia, if you haven't, and those of us who haven't also seen it, it's wonderful. It gives women the ability to write and talk about their own pains, their own bodies, their own sexualities, unapologetically, and female-to-female solidarity, which we never used to see in mostly, earlier films. Like if I think about a blockbuster like Sholay or whatever, so you have interesting female characters, but somehow they're isolated, and their greatest ally is a male hero, right? So when we talk about empowerment, I think these things, these subtle changes make a lot of difference. Bombay Begums, you'll have a mother and a daughter's relationship, and it's not deified, nor is it objectified. I think that's when true empowerment in cinema comes in. You are neither saying that, Nari is Kali or Durga and she's, going to give us all of that, nor are you saying, or she's an angel or anything, nor are you saying, for instance, that, she's completely oppressed or a victim or whatever. You don't have to be either or, you don't have to be good, evil, but women who are truly themselves. By that I mean in their historical context and also in their complexities. Why can't we see, and we do see that now, more women who have desires, and those desires are complex, they're not straightforward, there is angst and so on. And I think that's possibly where we can locate moments of empowerment and change.
Definitely. So with that and what Mayank has shared, I would like to come back to you, to Julia, because you have coined this term called state ableism, where women are expected to play the role of national caregiver. But at the same time, you have also had interest in the movie, and what you were mentioning, the two movies that are really interesting for you is another one, which is called Pinky Promise, which raises a very important question where why men's chests are never been sexualized, and the sexuality that we are talking about. So do you think that this disparity of what been sexualized for which human being is also being dictated by state to a certain extent, or is it the larger community or the social perspective that is there? And also being a breast cancer survivor yourself, you found it very deeply personal and reflective. So what do you say about this film, about Pinky Promise? And if you could just very briefly tell us about how do you feel that this movie is something which everyone should be watching?
Well, first of all, there is something that I used to say about the state ableism, which is based on my thesis, but it's now been a classic for 35 years. It's about the social construction of womanhood in New Order Indonesia. I used to say that state ableism is about the penetration of the state apparatus into civil society, okay? Pun intended, of course. I want to pick up on what you said about female solidarity, because the traditional way is of depicting women as women vying with each other for men's attention and the bickering and fighting. But this film, Pinky's Promise, is also from 2016. Is about a group of women who are engaged in, there's this, 4 of them have cancer, and breast cancer, and they all support each other. And I feel moved even now. They all, some of those had to go through chemotherapy, and so when their hair starts falling out, rather than having their hair in clumps and patches, they shave it. And then one of the 4 friends, does not have cancer, and she shaves her head off. I cried when I watched that. I mean, it was like, it had to be one take, obviously, right? This film is really interesting because it's not just about cancer or women's solidarity. It's about the commodification of women's bodies. Breasts, one of them. I mean, breasts to sell car tires. Have you seen ads like that? Women wearing a skimpy bikini or whatever to sell car tires. I mean, what the hell is the connection? And then there's also hair. Women, it's women's crowning glory. This is real, by the way. It's not fake, because people think it's fake. And so these things, and these women lose their breasts and their hair, which is supposed to define them as women, and they do it in such a courageous way. Some of them do die, but I think it really is a time to bust the bust, Let's bust the bust. It's why are men's nipples? Some actresses have free the nipples. Who was it? One of these in Hollywood. She went around walking in the streets with bare-breasted because she wanted to free the nipple. And there's Fenem, the Ukraine group, which is probably no longer. You know about Fenem group, the feminists, so they call themselves feminist group, who used to protest by baring their breasts, and they wrote slogans on their bare breast, and so I kind of had mixed feelings about that, because on the one hand it's like sensationalism, but on the other hand, why not? This idea of the double standard, but what's wrong with men's nipples and women's nipples? So let's free, you all probably have opinions about that, but I think this is, we're so conditioned by society. But anyway, I thought that was two really interesting films which portrayed a lot of women in society, not just Indonesian society, but other Asian and Western societies. I could talk about LGBT as well, but I probably stop at this, and we can maybe that can come in the discussion.
Yeah. So taking from what you just mentioned, it's when we talk about gender, it's not when we're talking about sexualization, we see that yes, women are largely the primary target, but we also see that that's now a new trend in Bollywood where men are also being used in item songs. So, and you, Mayank, you have specifically written and talked about the hyper-masculinity, which is, very profound in our Bollywood. And I think somewhere when we talk about, hyper-masculine heroes and their limited, and the way Bollywood provide a very limited space for alternative masculinity, but at the same time, when we say some people are aware of these toxic masculinity and the traits of it, at the same time, we are also selling movies like Kabir Singh, which is being used and as a blockbuster. Another movie which came as Animal, which was another blockbuster film where people are drawing from these masculinity and they believe that this is something which a real man or a real woman does. So and we have directors who made the movie Kabir Singh, I don't want to say, I believe everyone knows here, that he also spoke about this idea in one of his interviews that if you cannot slap the person you love, why are you in a relationship? So when you see these kind of representation of masculinity on the screen, what's your take on that, and how do you, want to see an alternative representation happening?
Well, so this might be a slightly unpopular opinion to have, and firstly, men should basically shut up when feminism is discussed. So apologies beforehand before I even say a word of what is likely to be an unpopular opinion. But I think there are two ways of looking at cinema, and I feel that one level we treat it as the most frivolous thing around, and we assume that it has no influence on us at all, and that's one end of it. And the other end, we give all our life and society's evils and we post it on films because that's where it's all emanating from. And I think both are extremes and both don't represent the reality. So because you used two particular examples of a particular director's film, that I noticed that when Animal came out, like literally, firstly, the outrage is absolutely understandable. All right, what is being shown is really not on. Have we seen these things before? Perhaps we have. So you could see traces of the hyper-masculinity in, say, the films of Martin Scorsese. There is nothing likable about the lead character of Taxi Driver, for instance, right? Now, has there been outrage over it in the past? Yes. You see Joker, and you see Joaquin Phoenix in Joker. Has there been a massive outcry against Joker? Yes. So I think so long as it is limited to an outcry, where you, as an audience, also make a pushback, it's perfectly fine. I start getting wary when this public outrage becomes a slight outlet or an inlet more than an outlet into state intervention, censorship, societal censorship, where you cannot show this. I'm like, you may not like it, but does it reflect in some ways the reality of what it is? Are you glorifying masculinity to a point where that film in particular, and both those films that you mentioned, seem like an angry young man, but a very privileged angry young man?
Yeah.
Does that reflect something of our society? Hell yeah. You get on Twitter and all you see is that privileged class, but the anger is coming from there, which is very different from the angry young man of the 1970s that, Javed Akhtar is going to be there tomorrow, and I can see why he was outraged by Animal. Right. So but you must ask him that question, and again he'll say this, and again that guy is going to react. That same director is going to react. But listen, do you not want him to say something? Let him say it. I think that dialogue needs to come from both ends, and so I thought too much was made of Animal, and I think too little, on the other hand, is made of some amazing stuff that we watch now, and they kind of balance each other out. I feel for the longest, because of purely the production system of cinema, I think cinema has been hyper masculine actually comes from the fact that it's actually a male heteronormative medium. That's really what it's been. That it has been its main audience. Those are the people it was made for, and those are the people it has been made by. The change that you see now, for instance, I'll give you an example, since we're talking examples of movies, I'll give you an example of a film called Girls Will Be Girls. I don't know how many of you got to see it. It's, if I'm not mistaken, it's on Prime Video, Amazon Prime Video. It won a top award at Sundance Film Festival last year. Shuchi Talati is the director, a female gaze completely, and it's about a young boy who is the boyfriend of this young girl. They're both in high school, and the young boy falling for the mother, right? Now, when I'm watching that film, the first thought that comes to me as that male audience, the typical male audience who's been watching movies all his life in a typical way, is like it's going to become like The Graduate. It's a 1967 film. There's a Mrs. Robinson. There'll be a seductress who'll come out, and that'll be the mom, and we'll all have fun. But there is another way of looking at it, and I'm glad that we're able to see it that way. If anything, the female voice in India, when it comes to cinema, has never been more important than just the year that we're sitting in. Right? The first film in 30 years to compete at Cannes is a film about 3 women made by a director who was a female, and that director became the first director in the history of Golden Globe to be nominated for the Oscars as Best Director. Yeah. Right? And Girls Will Be Girls is an example I gave you already. This is also the same year that the first time an Indian actor has won a top award at Cannes, Anasuya Sengupta, and that's again a female act. I think what we are seeing right now is a deep interest in this voice that did not exist. Earlier did not exist because they were not part of the production system. Later they didn't exist because they're perhaps not part of the audience system. Right now both exist because audiences come from not just theaters but also OTTs. And of course, as Sonali pointed so well, there's never been a higher percentage of females working in films than ever before. And I'm not just talking about Bombay, literally everywhere in India right now. So of course it shows, because it's also a lens and a mirror, it shows in the work as well.
So taking from there, and what you were saying, that it requires that dialogue from both the end, from the filmmakers as well as from the audience. I'll take back to the question which Sonali, you were mentioning about Alankrita Srivastava film, Lipstick Under My Burqa, which got actually banned because it was talking about female sexuality and showcasing a woman who is in the age of 50s, rediscovering her sexuality, that being banned altogether. So my question to you is that, because you are someone who is also writing about feminist perspective, you are writing also literature, you are writing poems about it. So as someone who works at the intersection of feminism and storytelling, do you think female protagonist alone is enough to challenge the patriarchal narrative, or do we need more radical shift in storytelling altogether, like what Mayank was mentioning?
Yeah. Absolutely, lovely question. I think I cannot underplay the importance of having female protagonists. One, I think it's terribly important, whatever they may be doing on screen, right? So a lot of feminists have worked, for instance, on the Saas Bahu serials. Most people thought, of course, they were regressive and so on and so forth. But what it did also show, and also evidence for us, is that women are large consumers also of entertainment and the screen, right? And so we are making things for them specifically. Now, which women you are making it for, that's a whole other question, right? So we are also talking about post-liberalized India, especially for the Saas Bahu serials. Capitalism has a funny way of joining hands with, patriarchy. Anything that already exists that's oppressive, capitalism will somehow, join hands and say, okay, let's work together. I think what happened here is, at one level, you are showcasing women, more women on screen and so on. It's a woman who's producing it and everything. But at the same time, you are back in reinforcing some of these dangerous patriarchal stereotypes that the woman's place is in the house, women are scheming, or they're angelic, and so on and so forth. However, like I said, we cannot underplay the importance of having more women on screen. I'm thinking of, even like Mayank mentioned, angry young men films and so on. I was watching some of them recently. Who are the women there, and what are they doing? Why are we not angry about that? I understand that Animal and Kabir Singh and all, they're terrible films, and they are about hyper-masculine violence and so on. And yes, as Mayank said, there was a lot of outrage, but that outrage is also a good sign, as he was pointing out. Why wasn't there outrage in the 70s about, let's say, the domesticated woman, right? There is Jaya Bachchan's character in Abhiman. Yeah, she's a singer. Her voice is taken away from her, and there is no resistance. The film was a big hit, right? It's very male-centric. Why do we not? We have a lot to say about hypermasculinity, and when especially it shows itself as violence, as physical violence. But what about the violence of structuring women as submissive, subjugated, and so on? We don't see that. We don't read that as violence, right? So I think therein, right, the reaction and the response also is something that maps the change. Alankita Srivastava's film, as you said, obviously the censorship itself shows that it's resistance at work, isn't it? Yeah. Right? Otherwise, it's threatening something of society. Why else is it being censored? But coming back to censorship, I think it's very important to remember that these were colonial laws. And I think Mayank would definitely have something to say about this also. I don't know how many of you know, initially you could show women's bodies on screen. So we have the item number still. But you can't show an actress kissing in India. Okay, so what are you saying? This is patriarchy 101. You are saying a woman expressing desire is to be censored. That's a problem. Women having agency over their sexuality is a problem. But a woman through a male gaze providing pleasure for a certain kind of male audience, that's okay. And hence the proliferation of item numbers. I don't have a problem, Pooja, with item numbers at all. But I have a problem with the way censorship operates and also how it produces a certain kind of a woman. So a 60-year-old woman looking into her sexuality is dangerous, as she should be, I think, yeah.
So taking again from there, because the way we present women on screen is very much impactful, be it women who are being domesticated, be women who are out there, like movies like Mardani has been made, which is again a linguistical problem that we have in our society, that we do not know any other terminology to kind of express what is a strong woman. So we have a term called mard, which is strong masculine, for Julia, for your reference, and Mardani is someone who is also masculine but a woman. So in that situation, our society is somehow structured in that one. So in that reference, I want to come back to you, Julia, with the larger aspect of Asian cinema that we see. I had this discussion with few of my students in film club as well, that when we see women being represented, especially in horror, Asian horror cinema, we see women are largely being presented as monstrous figure. Every time when there's a horror film, it's largely female figure who are representing. So do you think that these horror films or the horrible idea of women is the society's projection and their fear for the gender and power? What's your take on that?
Well, Actually, I think that's really interesting. You know, I think that you can see the phenomenon of horror movies in different ways. I'm not a fan of horror movies myself, but it does actually. It's a kind of woman empowerment because the woman monster or whatever character. Is like in Indonesia we have the kuntilanak, which is somebody who has arisen from the grave, and she has long hair and a hole in her back, you know, and she entices men. And if you think about it, these women do have agency. That's one way of, they can devour the men. They can, you know, that and I think that's it's a kind of a fantasy. It's a way of expressing this it's an indirect way of having agency, because you can't have it in real life, so you can have it in a fantasy like a horror movie, you know. And I have a friend who's a writer. She writes horror short stories, you know, and that's her way of expressing it. I think when it comes to other women characters that I see in Indonesian films, I'm talking about Indonesian films now because that's, I suppose, what. No, I'm not just familiar with Indonesian films, but because I'm representing Indonesia, I will talk about. It's usually heroines. Like we have Cut Nyaden, who is a freedom fighter. She actually fought against the Dutch. You know, she armed battle, and then there have been a number of films about Kartini. She's our national heroine. She actually died at the age of 25. She's supposed to be. She's a symbol of our women's emancipation in Indonesia. I used to be against her because she was against polygamy, but in the end she succumbed to polygamy because she loved her father. But you know, you have to think of things in the context. And then it's strongly suspected that she was poisoned by her co-wives, and she died shortly after she gave birth. So there are characters like that. I'd like to mention another film talking about women's sexuality. It's made by Nia Dinata. She's one of the first women. She's in her 50s now. She's one of the first. I think she's one of our best female directors. Forget about the female. She's just one of our best Indonesian directors. And I think there's a film. It's called Berbagi Suami, Sharing a Husband, about these women in polygamous marriage. And you know what? The women are involved, the co-wives are involved in a lesbian affair. Nice, huh? Yeah, nice, huh? You know, and it's shown in the movie, kissing, okay? So these things do happen, you know. I mean, they are shown in Indonesian cinema. But I think the question is, as was mentioned before, to what extent does this actually influence real gender constructions? You know, now because everybody is becoming more right-wing. There's child marriage. I mean, there are topics that I've been writing about child marriage since like 20 years ago, and it's still the same. It's actually gotten worse, you know. Like this, the bride kidnapping in Sumba. I was intending to ask the director why this was not portrayed in the film, in Marlinda, Murder in Four Acts, because that's one of the most famous things about Sumba Island, and of course it's child brides, yeah. So I think that there has been a lot of change, but it depends. Film is not probably powerful enough to change actual practices, you know. But having said that, now there is young people and women are getting married later, or not getting married at all. Or if they get married, they don't want to have children. I think that is a change, but I don't know if that's really about films, related to films, or it's just a societal change.
So taking from you, what you were mentioning that you wanted to ask this question to the director, why he did not add this particular idea about child bride kidnapping. So on that note, there's a larger perspective that what a director is also willing to showcase to the larger audience. So from there, Mayank, I want to come to you and ask, because you have interviewed countless filmmakers, directors, and actors. So do you think male filmmakers, especially because when we're talking about filmmakers, people largely believe that female filmmakers are willing to showcase female stories, but sometimes the narrative can be very different. But when we talk about male filmmakers, do you think that they are willingly thinking about what they are representing on the screen, about the gender, or is it still the secondary idea for them and they just want to put their story out there?
Okay, so here's the thing, right? Firstly, you can watch any film through multiple lenses, and one of the lenses is a narrative lens anyway, right? You can watch films from the way it's shot, from the way the performances are, from the writing, etc., etc. Too many things are a part of it. If someone is sitting and thinking, I have a feeling they're frauds. And the beauty of film is such a naked medium that I don't need to make that conversation with someone to see if they are feminists. You will be able to see it right there. It's very, very difficult to hide something. You can even hide behind words sometimes, but you can't hide behind a lens, or you can't hide behind a canvas. It's out there. And which is why my sense is there are a lot of people who think they've made feminist movies. And I'm coming back to your original point, Pooja, about horror. We've actually grown up, and this is again my theory, we've actually grown up in a lot of horror movies that will show the horrors that a woman goes through, all right? And what's known as female in jeopardy, fem-jep movies, where she's going through hell, and because actually that movie is made for a predominantly male audience, the men are enjoying the hell that she's going through. Eventually, of course, she'll trump the circumstances and she'll come out fine. But the process of it will make you believe, oh my God, this is the hell that she's going through, but why am I watching this? You're watching it because there is some pleasure in a woman going through hell. All right? And so while they may typically seem like feminist movies, and these people will talk about their feminism, but because it's such a naked medium, you can tell what that man did. All right? And I can give you multiple examples, and it will be unfair perhaps for me to give you examples, because it will be like singling two films out. It's a full genre. It's a full genre of horror movies that Hindi cinema has had over time, right? So there is that aspect of it. I think that's important to understand, where someone's grandstanding, maybe they have a lot more to show for something they actually lack. Someone who is a feminist, you don't need to say it, you'll be able to see it, right? You can tell from a shot that this shot was taken why and how and what does it represent. I don't need some gyan on feminism from you in an interview when I can see that bum shot right there. Right? And then you can give all the gyan, but actually you are pleasing a certain audience and there's a certain mindset. So there's a lot of lip service that happens, and I don't just mean this for feminism, a lot of lip service that happens with all other aspects of what would be a theoretical content of a film. But because it's such a naked medium, I don't even need to ask that question. Just to respond on Sonali's point, I think there is one more observation to be made when it came to the kitchen politics of our television industry. And it has struck me recently about how, back in the 2000 is when the television soap opera became the huge thing, of course, with a woman helming it all, but really made for a female audience that was sitting at home watching these TV soaps. But it was largely about women and how scheming they are and how they're sitting at home and they're homemakers. And in a way, if you see it from a male lens, I could see that the men were being lampooned even far more. They had zero agency. They were just hanging around on the side, which is a great subversion of how we watch movies. But I think now the top show from Kyonki Saas Bhi Kabhi Bahu Thi, right now the top show is about a woman who works, and that is a dilemma. So even there, you can see some sort of, and of course these things are complex, and it's not always linear. But if you were to draw a larger diagram, you will see a movement which is positive rather than negative, which again, as I keep saying, it's not true for every other aspect, certainly not true for politics and religion. These are my two other pet peeves, but never mind that.
So taking from your point and coming to you, Sonali, for this question, that I have seen one of another video of yours when you were talking about Gangubai, and that when a filmmaker is making a film, and he might think that's a very strong feminist character that you are putting out there, but even there are certain subtleties where you can find the glimpse of that. And here comes an academic lens, which I want to add the question to, is that what does the role of film criticism and academic discourse bring in changing the dominant narrative and what we are talking about, and why do we need to have the panel with all these distinguished guests for all our audience, and how do you think this can be taken forward from here?
Yeah, I'll share a personal anecdote. I used to be invited to Whistling Woods, which is a film school, and I used to take courses on gender and cinema and nationalism and cinema. And I won't say who, but not that he would mind, said, it's lovely work and so on, but what is an academic, film academic doing in a film school? Yeah, and at that time I had no answer. And I thought, yeah, but to me, it looked like the obvious thing, that there should be dialogue between those who are consuming it and those who are learning to read cinema and those who are making cinema. But somehow we think that we should not pollute the artist's imagination by bringing in criticism. Criticism is looked at as somehow the other of, right? I think this is a false binary, Pooja. And it's high time we sort of, challenge it and break it down and so on. I do both. I'm an artist, I'm a writer, I'm a poet, but I'm also an academician. And I think that critical lens, that academics gives us is, it not just helps us as consumers to be more discerning consumers. What are we watching? It helps us understand that. Like Mayank said, there's a lot of, I would use the word masquerade or disguise. Is this truly a feminist film? Is this truly an emancipatory film? Or is it just something that has co-opted an idea, of, let's say, Dalit struggle and has put a few Dalit individuals and so on, but really just an upper class film? How do you discern that? That you can only do when you learn to read cinema. You'll have to learn about film angles, like, cinematography, screenplay, dialogue, who's being given more screen space and who's not, what are the close-ups for, in order to really, really understand the politics and the aesthetics of that film. Otherwise, just having this character, like with Gangubai, as I've said, having a sex worker out there doesn't mean that you've made a very, very emancipated or a very subaltern kind of film. So it's important that the two dialogue. I'm not saying it's necessary that a filmmaker do a crash course in, cinema studies or anything, but it's also necessary for us to be able to learn to read cinema. And I'll just quickly say, Pooja, many of the times when I teach films, my students will often say, but ma'am, she was asking for it. Or such and such was, horrifying. Or such and such was being, so taunting or so negative. It's understandable that he lost his patience or whatever. And I'm thinking, what's happening here? You are reading a narrative as though it's real, as though you were there and that the truth is playing out in front of you, instead of asking how has it been framed in such a way that this woman has been made to appear as someone who supposedly, very dangerous idea, deserves violence. That's the question that I want to equip students to, be able to unpack, right? Not to take what cinema is showing you on screen as face value and say, bichari or bichara or whatever's terrible, this happened to and all. It's not truth in that obvious sense. Films are not like that, right? You have to learn to read and, deconstruct. That's important. Yeah.
Can I ask a question to my two Indian colleagues here? Because I mentioned briefly LGBT. Can you talk about the portrayal of LGBT characters in Indian movies? I'm very interested.
So actually, based on that, I have, maybe because of a paucity of time, we might not go deeper. But on that note, actually was about to ask all of you, maybe if you could just give your closing remark on that. That when we talk about this gaze, it's not just the gender gaze or female gaze or female gaze. There's also queer gaze. And also, we are living in a world where OTT is becoming a new go-to-go for everything. So we are also watching something which we might want to watch or which is being imposed on us. So there's also a controlled gaze of this OTT platforms, which I say corporate controlled gaze. So when we talk about that, if I have watched some movies like maybe Animal, I will get tons of other options to watch movies like that. If I have watched a queer film, maybe I'll get dozens of other options on that. So how do you kind of interpret and kind of unravel all these gays that we are talking about, including the queer gays that you know, if every one of you could answer that. Maybe we can start with you, Mayank.
Sure. No, so my sense is, and this would be true for LGBT as well, I think the first time that I was exposed to a lot of LGBT content was when I was on the jury of Kashish Film Festival, which at the time seemed like so far out there. I wrote a piece for the New York Times on how there is an LGBT film festival going on in Bombay. And this would be, I would presume, not more than 8 or 9 years ago. There is, of course, a legislation that took place. There was a striking down of 377 that completely changes a societal view on the community. And I think there is obviously a lot more work to be done on that front, and that work will also come from more LGBT people in the making, in the production system of content, as it were, where you're seeing far more of it. I think the beauty of a film is in the joy of it alone. And the moment you give it the burden of feminism, give it the burden of Dalit emancipation, I mean, give it the burden of anything beyond the fact that its primary objective is entertainment, you give it more burdens, I think you shoo the audience away. As I said, I only make unpopular opinions here. I think if the film, so my favorite film, for instance, to do with LGBT is this joyous movie called Rainbow Rishta on Amazon Prime Video, which is a documentary of 6 people in love. Now, if you make a film about love, the LGBT will stop mattering to you. And I think that mainstreaming is where we've reached from a point where it seemed like such a far-out idea that there is an LGBT film festival going on in Bombay. So in that sense, one, there has been thankfully a huge legislative empowerment that's taken place, which makes life easier for everyone. We've come a huge distance from the fact of there was a movie called Dostana, which is a mainstream film starring 2 mainstream leads, and I couldn't understand what the point of the film was. The joke was that they could be gay. I mean, what is so funny? That these 2 people could be gay. So, but then again, you could tell that they were seeding an idea into a world which is not even accepting of them, even from a legal point of view. So you could see the movement that they were making. I think we've reached a point where it need not be an LGBT film. It could be a romantic film. It need not be a feminist film. It could be a film about a kitchen. I don't think anybody watches Great Indian Kitchen and thinks, oh my God, feminism. No, you're just struck by the sound of the film. You're struck by the reality of that film. They're not pushing an agenda. I think the moment you push an agenda, you stop getting the big numbers that you need to normalize all those things that we want in our lives. So yeah, and also just to end on a note, because it was also there in my introduction, read beautifully by the lady out there. I actually joined Censor Board to write a piece that's there in my book, and it was more like I was a decoy. I was a bit of a embedded journalist inside to see how censorship works. And you know what? And it's used and it's put on my Wikipedia. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm ashamed of the fact that it could ever been something called Censor Board. But then you also realize that with censorship, because we kind of touched upon state and censorship, it is so random. It is so random that you can use the same law and ban Tom and Jerry. It really depends on who's at the top, and that changes from time to time. So I don't think we should care too much about the state. I think we should care too much about how everything is being normalized, everything is being mainstreamed, and I think LGBT has to be. And I think we're going that direction with LGBT as well.
Have you guys seen Brokeback Mountain?
Of course.
Yes. How moving was that?
Yeah.
I mean, there's the scenes between them. So I kind of agree with you. It's a human thing when you talk about love, then
It is about love.
Who cares?
Right.
You know, who is it?
And Philadelphia, for that matter. That was the first film I saw that, made me start to think about queer love, right? Love is love. That's the sense that one gets,
right.
even with Brokeback Mountain, right? Yeah. So, I don't know how many of you have seen Gangubai Kathiawadi here. I'm coming back to that. When we say male gaze, Pooja, we forget that it's also a heteronormative male gaze. Yeah, that film proves that very well. That's why I'm using it. Not that because she brought it up or it's a pet peeve or anything like that. There's some good things happening. Razia's character, I don't know if you remember it, right? There is a queer sex worker. And it is the truth of India that a lot of queer people are in sex work. Why? Also because of lack of acceptance in mainstream society, right? So this becomes, you also, just like you say, women belong to their bodies and sexualize those bodies and see them as reproductive, organs alone and so on. This also happens with queer individuals, right? You only see them for their sexuality or their bodies, and it's not even an accepted sexuality, but an othered one. So they end up in sex work. Now here's a film that's supposedly about sex work, and it takes one woman and heroizes her, this Brahmin woman, let's not forget also, and in a very problematic manner, but it also criminalizes and demonizes the queer sex worker. I'm just going to use the term they, but Razia's character is portrayed as though literally, like some kind of, if you know Dickens, Uriah Heep or something, crawling like a snake, slithering around this supposedly very stoic, heteronormative woman who has everything. This is not, like coming back to, feminism and so on. I agree with Mayank. It's not on a director to be feminist and so on, but the awareness comes from critique. And that's how society changes. So then you are inspired to hopefully, write a script that changes this script, right? This kind of heteronormative male gaze needs to be contested. And yes, means of production, I completely agree with this, Pooja. That's what I was trying to say in the beginning also. It's not just the narrative screenplay and so on. Means of production need to be owned by those who haven't owned it so far. So if more Dalit women pick up, which they're already doing, the camera and show their stories, right? That's when things will really change. We don't have to teach anyone to do that, but teaching aids in, empowers in that kind of shift in means of production. That's it.
Thank you so much, and I think we have this space allotted to our next session, but very wonderful questions, and I would say yes, and very wonderfully answered by all of you, because I wanted to kind of connect with you so that we have a larger audience who are a watcher audience, and they also now, after COVID has been settled, everyone is going back to theater. So we are enjoying that theatrical understanding and experience. So if any one of you would like to have a question, okay, we have one student.
My name is Dhriti Modi. So there has been very good films such as Chapak, Pink, Gulab Gang, Anuja, which is an Oscar nominee, and the recently Mrs., which portrays women suffering in an Indian society. But when we see such movies which portrays women suffering, there are three angles a movie is seen. First is, oh my God, she has suffered a lot, and the thought is over. The second one is, oh, I have to be careful. Such things can happen with me as well in the society. And the third one is, all men are same, because these movies portrays men in that form. And then there is every coin has two sides. Such a movie is Section 375, which portrays how a woman misuses law. In this movie, a woman misuses a rape law. So this is how the movies portray women. So it doesn't portray crimes as per se. So it puts, people consume what they observe. So it puts in the mind of the observers seeing the movie that a woman and men, these are two genders, and woman has to fight men to win, but it does not portray actually what the crime is. So, for example, in the movie Chapak, the man was supported by a woman for the acid attack, but that was never portrayed. So my question is for the panel. So whether such movies which the audience consume, whether there should be a movie where, not in a romantic gesture, but as a human being, how a woman should be treated properly should be given.
I'll quickly answer. Yeah, I like Chapak a lot, but I had several problems with it. One, I think the film focuses a lot on the man who helps her, rather than show her as, you know, if you look at the real life story that they based it on, that's not the case. So this is the way in which Bollywood often responds. When you were talking about co-option earlier, so thank you for asking that very astute question. Pooja was also making this point. It will co-opt something that exists, you know, in the air or has suddenly got eyeballs and turn a film from it. But you will be able to, like Mayank was saying, it's a naked medium, but I don't agree it's a naked medium in the sense that you have to learn to read it. You'll be able to see that this is a co-option. It moved me, Chapak. But it also lost something in making it an isolated story. Yes. I think that's where this whole narrative that you're saying, this grief comes from, and then you forget about it. Oh, this poor woman had to go through. But that's not the truth, you see. The truth is India has a high number of women who are facing. And so if a film can show you what are the reasons for this acid attack. I saw a Malayalam film, I'm forgetting, where the woman ends up as a pilot in the end. Uyari, yes. I think that does it better, where it shifts the focus also to the entitled, toxically angry man, young man, who thinks that if he loves someone, desires someone, they should love him back in the way he wants it. And when that doesn't happen, he throws acid. But it is done so beautifully because you see the context to why such a thing can happen. And you don't see it as an isolated incident. Anyone who watches knows that, yes, many of us know that we've seen these kinds of men in our life, right? So it's not an all-men story then. So it's all in the delivery of the film, I would say, how you show it.
There's one last question we'll take.
Yeah, so thank you for this wonderful session. My question is all the three panelists. So my name is Shilajit. I am a faculty here of political science in Allen School of Law. So my question is that, do you think, all of you, whoever wants to answer this, that there is a clear-cut, a binary club that is getting produced as an art house movie which takes care of the topics like feminism, like LGBTQ, and these issues, and there is a clear-cut commercial side of the movie, let's say Bollywood or even Hollywood to some extent, which keeps on maybe sucking out the commercial agenda and the profit out of by making a very typical binary, heteronormative, heterosexuality, ultra-violent movies which depicts gender in a very, very binary mode. One is that. Also, with that, if we are talking about movies and proper full-fledged feature movies, why we are not also taking care of what is regularly getting produced in reels and in advertisements? Like you just take for the sake of any detergent advertisement or advertisement of Horlicks. The way the gender positionality has been always described. On the other hand, if you see the jokes or the jocularity that is being produced in the forms of reels, it's very, very much gender-based and gender-biased. And it shows, even there are, I don't have to mention, but there are reels which just shows women has to be stupid drivers, which is awful. There are millions of videos, reels on that. And it's getting produced and getting consumed by Gen Z, Gen Beta, Gen Alpha, Gamma, everybody. So where we are really having a check, or can we really have very properly, equitably distributed cultural practice, which can be really making a change? Also, the gentleman, he also wanted to ask one question, I'm just tagging it, that sometimes movies have been made, like PK, which has given a very false narrative, or maybe it has been understood in a very wrong way. What we can do about it?
My sense is that PK would be a tough film to make in 2025. That's really where we've reached, and that's exactly where we started this conversation from. There is a huge leap when it comes to feminism, but a leap backward when it comes to lots of other things that we need to question about our society, and that is the tragedy of it. They got away. Right now, they would not be able to get away. The second bit is about reels, and that really, I find it's a discussion I would love to have with Gen Z at some point, or Gen Alpha at some point, It's not about popular culture and popular representation. It's about agency here. When I'm randomly watching my reels, the sexualization of women by women is way higher than any advertising will ever reach. All right? And the number of likes it gets, it's also kind of encouraging them to sexualize further. And, to each their own, honestly speaking. It's none of my business say what you put out. It's your Instagram reel. Please put out whatever works for you. But it's a very interesting, and again, from a feminist lens, it's a very interesting conversation to be made. What do the Gen Z think about this particular phenomenon, which is noticeable pretty much practically through the day? So now you can't say, oh, popular culture shows this. You can't say we're using breasts to advertise for tires. You're doing it yourself. You are advertising yourself every second, and what you're doing is essentially just take your clothes off. Interesting, right? It'd be interesting to see it from that lens. The first part, was there an art house and is there a mainstream? I think there will always be. There will always be. We may be in a better state now where it is possible. The content creation is democratic enough that all kinds of voices can exist, whether on OTT, whether on social media, and of course there is a theatrical entertainment as well. And it's never been any different. It's just a little different in the sense of it being better now than it's ever been before.
Absolutely, very, very good questions, and I agree with a lot of what Mayank said. But I wonder whether we have understood sexualization entirely, Mayank, because sometimes it's also about women owning their bodies. And we are in this country, there is a lot of confusion. I get this question a lot of the time. Women objectify themselves, and I'm saying, hey, stop. Just because they're wearing whatever they want to wear, whether it's a push-up bra or whatever. No one's asking men why they've put gel in their hair and so on, or taking their shirt off if they want to or not wanting to. That's a kind of objectification also. The silent masculinity. We have seen heroes like that, right? Ajay Devgan plays it so well in Omkara, right? So, there's all kinds of objectification. So I think we have to be very careful when we think about sexualization. One is it at the service of something, right? That's where her question on also the corporate eye, the capitalist eye is also very important. What are women, if they're doing it, what are they doing it for? And do they have power in the way they are owning their bodies and doing it for themselves? I heard something very interesting since we are talking about Gen Z, is it? Right? I don't know what alphabet we are at, but somebody said that, you think I wear makeup for you? She's saying to her, it's like a meme kind of thing, to her boyfriend. I have 25 shades of red, and you can't, distinguish between pink and red, and you think I wear makeup for you. Right? So it's also in the eye. When a woman dresses up or does something, male gaze comes in there, where the way we read that. Is it being done for me, to entice me? And sure enough, that can also happen. But there's no problem there, I think, Mayank. That's not an issue. Sure, if somebody wants to sexualize themselves. But we need to think about the larger questions, I think, of the financial oppression, the economic oppressions that may be forcing women and men now to be prey to certain forms of sexual oppression. And I think there, not just the film industry, there are lots of other questions of labor and workplaces. Nobody talks about the domestic space. That's also very, very important to look at. Yeah. I think there was one more question. I don't know about PK. I think Julia would like to answer that. But what was your first question? I think that was important. If you could.
House and mainstream.
Yeah. I don't agree that, yes, of course they can remain. But again, it's not to say that art house cinema has all the answers. I've seen a lot of art house cinema, for instance, as I said, that will portray, Deepti Nawal and Farooq Sheikh films. As much as I love them, agency is often with the man in terms of, decision making, when they will marry and so on. The woman is often very silent. And again, the way the body is constructed, the way the lighting is done, the song lyrics, you have to look at all of that. It's not necessarily something deeply radical either. So that, again, is a false kind of, I would think. And I think there are a lot of intersections between the two. And it's nice to see. It's exciting to see when that happens, when something is liminal. It's little art house and it's not, and so on. And we don't have to define it also in order to enjoy it and read it. Yeah.
I think I'm not sure if I captured all the questions correctly, but commercial films can also be quite very progressive, like the Berbagi Suami, the one with the polygamous marriage where the wives are. I mean, that was very well. That was commercially successful as well. And I suddenly remember. Do you remember Thelma and Louise?
Yes.
Thelma and Louise. I mean,
Yeah.
that is my go-to feminist movie, and it wasn't even supposed to be. It eventually required the cult status. In the beginning, it was like, I mean, is this gonna work or not? You know, Brad Pitt was this, you know, I mean, young and handsome, and it became when I was watching the film, Marlina, I thought very much of Thelma and Louise, except for the fact that these two women, they remained alive in the Marlina, whereas Thelma and Louise, they took their lives. I mean, they decided, what the heck, you know, we're not going to survive in this. And I have to say something about this. I actually influenced my husband's decisions to make a more feminist, to have a more feminist approach in his films.
Thank you all for, answering it, in a manner that enlightened every one of us. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to say Pooja also deserves a huge round of applause. Very beautiful, very intelligent questions, right?